Over the game's 9-year history, there's been a ton of problematic perks. Some of them managed to more or less keep their identity even after a gazillion nerfs and reworks, for example Decisive Strike and NOED, but others weren't so lucky, because their design was so inherently flawed that the only way to fix them was to turn them into something completely new. One such perk was Tinkerer. Belonging to the Hillbilly, the original version of Tinkerer was arguably one of the most unique perks Dead by Daylight has ever had, because it essentially let you trade one of your perk slots for extra add-on slots. Not literally, of course, but functionally that's pretty much what it did. It made add-ons that affected the charge time of your power 15% more effective, which you could think of as creating a weaker copy of them. In the game's early days, these add-ons were very common, with every killer having several of them, and if you brought 2, Tinker would boost both, effectively giving you 4 add-ons of the same type. But how strong was that version of Tinker in practice? Honestly, not strong at all. Its description might make you think that 15% was added to an add-on's bonus as a flat increase. So, for example, if an add-on sped up the charge time by 10%, you might expect the total bonus to be 25%. But unfortunately, that's not how it worked. The thing is, Tinkerer's effect was originally multiplicative. It took me a while to figure out what that meant in this context, and to be honest, I'm still not entirely sure I got it right. But after some comparison tests, here is my understanding. Basically, Tinkerer took whatever bonus the add-on provided, treated it as 100%, and then added 15% on top, effectively multiplying it by 115, which is why the effect was considered multiplicative. This made its effect very humble. So humble, in fact, that it was basically placebo, even on killers with a super long base power charge time where it should have been most noticeable. The most telling example here is the Trapper. His power is trap-based, so technically there is nothing to charge, but since trap setting was the closest thing to it, the devs made Tinkerer apply to his trap setting speed add-ons. The default trap setting time for the original Trapper was a painfully long 6.2 seconds. By running Tinkerer with Trapper's gloves and setting tools, you could cut that down by 1.3 seconds, out of which Tinkerer's contribution was only 0.1 seconds. It could have been better, but the problem was that the old trap setting animation consisted of 3 parts: bending down, opening the trap, and straightening back up, out of which Tinkerer affected only the middle one, which left its effect very little room to work with. With the other 2 killers, the situation was a little better. Technically, with the Wraith's double swift hunt for uncloaking, which was his version of power charging, and Billy's spark plug and primer bulb, it also shaved off 0.1 seconds. But if you think about it in relative terms, that was actually stronger than on the Trapper. It's just Billy's and Wraith's base charge times were much shorter, 2.6 seconds and 3 seconds respectively, and 0.1 seconds of that made for a more noticeable decrease. But that's where I gotta remind you that that was the cumulative bonus from 2 add-ons. Now imagine if you only brought 1. The bonus would be so small that you'd have to be a complete numbnut to sacrifice an entire perk slot for that. Interestingly enough, Wraith's cloaking was also somehow considered power charging, so the 2 add-ons that decreased the cloaking time, Blink Suit and Blink Mod, were affected by Tinkerer as well. Sadly, only on paper. In reality, it sped up the cloaking animation by exactly 2 frames of a 60 FPS video. Just imagine the face of someone who ran this build back then thinking they actually accomplished something and who's learning about its uselessness just now. But that's not even the funniest thing about the original Tinkerer. Quite often alongside bonuses, behavior make add-ons provide small penalties. That gives them extra leverage for balancing them. In the past, these penalties often came in the form of longer power charging, which was affected by Tinkerer just like when this time was decreased. But the problem is that it didn't happen the way you'd expect. Instead of acting as a bonus and making the penalty less prominent, it did exactly the opposite, increased it and made it even more of a hindrance than it already was. Originally, only the Trapper had such add-ons. Out of curiosity, I tried stacking his fastening tools with 4-coil spring kit and ended up with an almost 7-second long trap setting animation. But that wasn't the absolute record. In the fall of 2016, as part of the update that expanded Killer's original 12-piece add-on sets with new items, the Trapper received Bloody Coil, which combined with the aforementioned fastening tools made trap setting last a mind-boggling 10 seconds. Survivors could literally heal in that time. The ideal solution to this problem would have been to make Tinkerer affect add-ons with negative modifiers positively, or alternatively to make it so it would simply have no effect on them. But this is behavior we're talking about here, so of course they went for the quick and dirty solution and just decided to not include the affected by Tinkerer line in the descriptions of these add-ons, so players wouldn't be tempted to try running them together. Another issue with the old Tinker was how inconsistently it applied to add-ons across different killers. For example, when the Nurse just came out, not a single of her add-ons was affected by Tinker. When the Hillbilly received his Doom engravings, Death engravings, Thompson's Mix and Carburetor tuning guide, initially only the latter worked with Tinker, even though all of them affected the chainsaw's charge time, whether positively or negatively. Same happened to Myers. At release, the add-ons affecting his stock rate, namely Judith's Journal, Memorial Flower, and Judith Myers Memorial, were also unaffected by Tinker. If I had to theorize why Behavior handled these add-ons this way, I'd rule out any balancing reasons right off the bat, because with how that version of Tinker was, there was just no way someone would ever think it could make even one add-on game-breaking. So my guess is that Behavior either overlooked those add-ons due to their typical sloppiness or deliberately skipped them due to time constraints. But at least this chaos didn't remain in the game for too long. Shortly after Myers' release, the devs revisited his stock rate add-ons and gave them a Tinker modifier. Later in patch 1.3.0, they did the same for almost all the other previously incompatible add-ons. The only add-ons that were ignored were the Nurse's purple ones, at least officially, because they weren't mentioned in the patch notes. In practice, in every version of the game I've tested, they worked with Tinker just fine, and I just refuse to analyze how and why that happened. Let's just write this off as Behavior's incompetence and forget about it. What's even more important, in that patch, the devs substantially increased Tinker's strength by making its effect additive, so its bonus would add directly to the bonus from add-ons like I've explained before. To say that this change made Tinker viable would be an understatement. Sure, the add-on still did most of the heavy lifting, but you actually felt its presence in your build now, and that's despite the bonus getting reduced from 15% to 10%. The killer that benefited the most from this buff was of course Myers, with his super long base charge time. Provided that he was stalking from a super close distance, getting from tier 1 to tier 3 took him about 10 seconds, 6.6 seconds if you used Tinker with Memorial Flower and Judith Myers Memorial, and if you swapped Memorial Flower with Judith's Journal, which gave a huge boost to stalking speed of the Obsession, you ended up with just slightly over 5 seconds. The Tinker value in that case was a whopping 0.7 seconds. For other killers it varied, but in most cases it was 0.2 seconds, which in case you need a reference is about the value of a Brown add-on. The least affected killer was the Trapper. His lowest trap setting time was 4.9 seconds, which if you do the math is exactly what he had before the Tinker buff. I struggle to explain how that happened, especially considering that when testing it I replaced Trapper gloves with the new and stronger trap setters, but that's how it was. However, about 5 months later, when the dev sped up phase 1 and 3 of his trap setting animation by 1 second each, this bonus became way more noticeable. Overall, it allowed him to set traps in just 3.7 seconds, which meant he could now do it in loops right in the middle of a chase without necessarily losing sight of the survivor. The next longest charge time belonged to the recently added Hag. Her vanilla trap setting time was 4.2 seconds, but with Tinker, Cypress Necklet, and Swamp Orchid Necklet, you could reduce it by almost a second, which, just like with the Trapper, made dealing with early detachers a little easier. On the Wraith with these old add-ons, Tinker allowed you to uncloak in 2.3 seconds and cloak in 1.6 seconds, and not that these were bad results per se. They weren't, especially considering that sometime before that, the devs updated both cloaking and uncloaking with a dedicated bell ringing animation, which increased their duration. But I wouldn't say it changed anything for the Wraith, because at that time his power was so weak it was barely worth using anyway. Being cloaked turned him into perfect bully material, because it made him burnable with flashlights and prevented from interacting with anything, and uncloaking didn't grant a short speed boost. But hey, at least the animations were fast, am I right? The Hillbilly's charging was even faster. With Primer Bulb and the newly buffed Carburetor tuning guide, Tinker pushed it as low as 1.7 seconds. This build was known as the Insta Chainsaw and basically made Billy impossible to loop. If the object you were trying to run around was longer than 2 meters, the second he got a clear line of sight to you, you were dead, because there was just no way you'd make it around the corner in time. But even that wasn't the lowest charge time. On the Nurse with Badman's Last Breath and Spasmodic Breath, Tinker let you charge blinks for maximum distance in just 1.6 seconds. Another thing worth mentioning about this version of Tinker is that it had a different logic when interacting with add-ons that negatively affected the charge time. Instead of further boosting the penalty, it now acted as a compensation for it. For example, if an add-on gave you minus 10% charge speed, Tinker would completely cancel it out and bring it back to 0. And that was very nice, because this way you got to benefit from positive properties of the add-on while completely ignoring the charge speed debuff. After the hack, the devs started experimenting with Tinker. Now its modifier could be found not only in the add-ons that increase the power charge speed, but also in the add-ons with various other properties. For example, the Doctor had 9 Tinker add-ons, out of which only 3 affected the charge speed of his shock attack. 3 increased the amount of madness survivors received from getting hit by it, and 3 more increased the amount of madness received passively from staying at his terror radius. The Hunters had 5 Tinker add-ons. 2 decreased the hatchet wind-up time, 2 decreased the cooldown between hatchet throws, and 1 decreased the reload time at lockers. Strangely enough, the descriptions of the wind-up add-ons Flower Babushka and Mana Grass Braid didn't say they worked with Tinker. It was obviously a bug, either on the code or text level, but it doesn't really matter. What does matter is that the community was pretty quick to realize that running them with Tinker did in fact boost their properties, which opened a Pandora's box. This build made the Huntress wind-up time so short that her hatchets became practically hit scan. She left you no time to dodge them at all. Once you heard her wind-up grunt, you were already dead, or at least injured. That build was known as the Machine Gun Huntress. Along with Bailey's Insta Chainsaw, it was one of the most broken Tinker builds in the history of that perk. Baba became the last killer whose add-ons officially supported Tinker. However, even he can be considered fully relevant, because in Behavior's true fashion they half-assed his release and didn't even bother to give him a unique set of add-ons. So initially he shared almost all of them with the Hillbilly, including the 6 Tinker add-ons. After him, new killers had no such add-ons at all, which made Tinker effectively without use on them. The reason the devs did them so dirty was that creating Tinker add-ons put an immense workload of additional coding on them. They even compared it to creating a second set of teachable perks for killers. With regular add-ons, all they had to do was make sure their effect was noticeable but not OP. But with Tinker add-ons, on top of that, they also had to account for their strength with and without the extra 10% boost. And of course, such add-ons couldn't be significantly weaker or stronger than their counterparts without the Tinker modifier. So naturally, instead of having to bother with all that, it was easier for them to just take Tinker out of the equation. The only time their new approach failed was with the Clown. Thanks to their impeccable coding skills, some of these add-ons ended up unintentionally supporting Tinker. But Clown mains didn't get to enjoy it for too long, because a month and a half later, Behavior said goodbye to this whole add-on madness and reworked Tinker into a gen defense perk. It didn't regress them directly. Instead, when a generator reached 85%, it notified you about it through an explosion sound effect and a bubble overlay and removed your terror radius for 12 seconds. That allowed you to control gens as efficiently as never before, cause now you knew exactly which of them required your immediate attention and when. And since survivors couldn't tell when you were coming, they couldn't run away from the gen early like they normally do, which meant you didn't have to hold W for half an hour before you could actually start a chase with them. Or if you were lucky, you could even pull off a gen grab. I can't say this version of Tinker caught on right away. A lot of people simply didn't understand it, and others still hung up on the old version and refused to use the new one out of principle. But boy were they wrong, cause it was really good, especially on killers with good map control, such as Billy and the Nurse. In fact, those two made it straight up broken. The thing is that version of Tinker had no cooldown, and thus could proc as often as survivors could reach 85% on a gen, even if it was the same gen multiple times back to back. So using the insane mobility of those killers, you could keep coming back to that gen over and over again, essentially soft locking it at the 85% mark. The no cooldown part applied not only to the Tinker's notification, but also to its terror radius reduction. This meant that if Tinker activated again while the previous 12 seconds of no terror radius still hadn't elapsed, the timer would reset and seamlessly prolong the effect. If you kept regressing gens once they hit 85% but the survivors immediately restored the progress, that let you keep your terror radius suppressed the whole time, essentially turning yourself into a full-on stealth killer. Of course, that's a purely theoretic scenario. In a real match, when and how many times Tinker activated depended entirely on the survivor's gen repair strategy, and the chances that they would be fixing them in a way that would conveniently allow you to overlap multiple instances of this perk were about zero. Nevertheless, sometimes when survivors were pushing several gens at the same time, Tinker could accidentally overlap. Not too many times, and it wasn't always perfectly timed, but even if it was, say, 20 seconds of no terror radius, it was still quite big. Especially on the Hillbilly, cause it made sniping survivors on gens much easier. And now with all that in mind, imagine what going against that version of Tinker felt like when the killer had a super tight 3-gen setup. It was a nightmare, and unless you were in an organized team on comms, there was practically no way out of it. Especially considering that at that time there was no limit on how many times killers could kick gens yet. This might be hard to believe, but that wasn't even the strongest iteration of the reworked Tinker. A year and a half later, the devs updated it with the undetectable status effect. Since its main thing is suppressing the terror radius, which Tinker already did, this might seem like a minor technical update that didn't bring anything new except for a fancy icon on the HUD. But that couldn't be further from the truth, because on top of no terror radius, Undetectable also removes the red glow and grants the aura rating immunity. The first made it easier for you to outplay survivors in close tiles. Normally the red glow lets them tell in advance when you're about to show up from behind the corner, which is why killers often hide it by moonwalking. Now if Tinker triggered during a chase for 12 seconds, you didn't need to worry about that. You could walk normally and survivors would still have a reduced time to react. The latter was even cooler, because it let you counter Tinker's biggest enemy, Object of Obsession. In its original form, this perk also revealed the killer's aura to the survivor and vice versa, but with a twist. It worked constantly, without even a slightest hint of cooldown, as long as the survivor was outside of the killer's terror radius, but not farther than 72 meters away and looking in their general direction. As you can understand, it removed any element of surprise from Tinker, because survivors could literally see when you were coming their way, and since there was no terror radius, Object kept working even when you were right near them. With Undetectable, that was no longer a thing, and you could happily ambush survivors even with the entire team running aura reading perks. But even that wasn't enough for Behavior. Not so long after the release of Pyramid Head, they buffed Tinker one more time by lowering its activation threshold to 70% and increasing the Undetectable duration to 16 seconds. This made controlling gens even easier, and that's when the perk really took off. By early 2021, its peak rate had reached more than 9%, and not long after it nearly 12%, which in today's terms is about the equivalent of a top 9 perk. 8 months after that, Tinker received its first nerf. Strictly speaking, it was a bug fix, but considering that bug had been in the game since the initial rework, you might as well call it an official feature. Anyway, in patch 4.6.0, Behavior made Tinker no longer activate after the last gen popped, which didn't hurt it too much, but made it so you couldn't intercept survivors running to the exit gates that easily anymore. In that state, Tinker had been for 2 years, until the summer of 2022, when due to its popularity and immensely oppressive nature, Behavior decided to nerf it again along with many other meta perks. As a result, Tinker started triggering only once per gen, regardless of how many times survivors crossed the activation threshold throughout the match. Overall, this decision was very much in line with Behavior's modern approach, where they take a problematic mechanic and balance it by limiting the number of times it can be used per match. Just look at what they did with Dead Hard and the gen regression cap system. And I can't say that I disagree with this decision, because at least it kept the identity of the perk. Despite such a big nerf, Tinker didn't fade into oblivion. Sure, it's not the cream of the crop anymore, but number 35 out of 136 is not too shabby either. With that said, I don't see Behavior changing this perk again in the near future, but if they ever do, I hope they will make it trigger with the last gen like before. It could really use it now that its usage per match is very limited.